They say the Sierra doesn't forgive easies. It buries secrets under snow and doesn't care who froze first sinners or saints. That morning, the stagecoach climbed the ridge like a coffin being dragged uphill, creaking with the weight of stories no one dared to speak aloud. A marshal with a half-frozen badge, a bride headed for a man she never met, a gambler hiding more than just cards, and a prisoner in chains who looked more like a man who'd lost everything than a killer. By nightfall, they'd all be stranded by storm, by fate, and by the lies they carried. The mountain doesn't care who's guilty, but you might. What would you have done if you were one of them? Would you trust the stranger beside you or guard your last loaf of bread? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Let's see how it all went down, shall we? The wind, a razor-edged harbinger of the deep Sierra winter, howled a mournful dirge around the swaying, beleaguered stagecoach as it clawed its way up from Carson's Ridge. Snow, thick as a woolen shroud, had been falling since dawn, obscuring the treacherous track and transforming the familiar peaks into ghostly, indifferent sentinels. Inside the coach, the air was frigid, thick with the scent of damp wool, stale breath, and the unspoken anxieties of its disparate passengers, each soul a small, flickering candle against the vast, encroaching darkness of the storm. Marshal Boone Calder, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard years and harder decisions, sat ramrod straight, his gaze fixed on the swirling white chaos beyond the patched leather curtain. His hands, gnarled and stiff with age, rested on the worn stock of the shotgun propped between his knees. Beside him, manacled and silent, sat Jesse Rook, the boy. For he was little more than that. Despite the haunted look in his young eyes, hadn't spoken a word since Boone had collected him from the territorial jail. His only visible possession, clutched tightly even in his sleep, was an old, tarnished silver locket on a frayed leather thong, a stark contrast to the grim purpose of their journey. Boone felt the familiar weariness settle deep in his bones. This was likely his last prisoner transport before the high passes became utterly impassable. His last duty before the snows truly locked them all in. Across from them, Claire Marlowe pressed herself into the corner, her gloved fingers clutching a worn reticule. Beneath the voluminous skirts of her best traveling dress, carefully stitched into the lining, lay her modest dowry, a secret hoard of coins that represented her entire future. She was bound for Weaver's Creek, to a man she knew only through 3 sparsely worded letters, a Mr. Silas Blackwood, who had advertised for a wife. Each lurch of the coach, each gust of wind that rattled the frame, seemed to echo the frantic thrumming of her own heart. Was she brave, she wondered, or merely a fool, trading a life of quiet desperation back east for an unknown fate in this wild, unforgiving land? Beside her, Elias Wynne, a man whose tailored coat and smooth manners seemed oddly out of place in the rough-hewn coach, appeared an oasis of calm. He'd offered a polite nod to his fellow passengers upon boarding, then retreated into a world of his own, his slender fingers occasionally shuffling a deck of playing cards. So worn, the kings and queens were faded ghosts. A close observer might have noticed a faint, almost obliterated insignia, a military marking, on the tattered card box he kept tucked in an inner pocket. His eyes, though, held a keen, watchful quality, missing little of the subtle dramas unfolding within their cramped confines. Huddled together for warmth on the opposite bench were the Grangers. John, a farmer whose weathered hands spoke of honest toil, and his wife, Martha, her face etched with worry as she held their small daughter. Molly, close, Molly, a child of perhaps 5 winters, her bright, curious eyes peeking out from beneath a woolen bonnet, seemed the only one untouched by the oppressive gloom, occasionally humming a tuneless song that was quickly swallowed by the wind's roar. And then there was Sister Mercy, seated beside the Grangers, her black habit a stark contrast to the swirling snow. She was an island of quiet contemplation. Her face, framed by a crisp white wimple, was lined with the wisdom of years and a deep, a biting compassion, yet, beneath the serene surface, Boone sensed a familiar steel. He'd known her long ago, in another life, it seemed, when she was simply Mercy Flanagan, a nurse tending to broken bodies and shattered souls in the blood-soaked fields of the war. Their paths had diverged sharply since then, her life devoted to God, his to the often brutal letter of the law. They hadn't exchanged more than a few necessary words since she'd boarded at Carson's Ridge, yet her presence was a tangible thing, stirring ghosts he'd thought long buried. The first scheduled stop, a lonely, wind-battered way station called Coulter's Pass, offered a brief, grudging respite. The passengers, stiff and chilled to the bone, gratefully disembarked, seeking the meager warmth of the station's potbelly stove. Boone, after ensuring Jesse Rook was securely tethered to a post near the door, found himself standing beside Sister Mercy near a grimy window, both watching the hostlers struggle to unhitch the exhausted team. "The mountains haven't changed much, Boone," she said, her voice soft, yet carrying clearly over the low murmur of the station. "Still demand their pound of flesh from any who dare to cross them unprepared." Boone grunted, his gaze distant. "Nor have the souls who try to outrun their own shadows across them. Sister," he paused, "it's been a long time." "Mercy?" A faint, melancholic smile touched her lips. "Indeed, it has, Marshal. We've both found different uniforms to wear, it seems." Her eyes, though, held a warmth that belied the formality of her address, a shared understanding that transcended the years and their divergent paths. "Some storms," she added, her gaze drifting back to the swirling snow, "feel more familiar than others." Inside, near the counter where lukewarm coffee was being dispensed, Claire Marlowe found herself the unwelcome object of attention. Two rough-looking trappers, their faces flushed from cheap whiskey, had taken note of her solitary state and the careful way she held herself. "Well now, looky here, Jed," one of them drawled, his eyes lingering on Claire. "A pretty little bird, all alone. Lost your way, Missy." Claire's cheeks burned. She clutched her reticule tighter, her gaze fixed on the muddy floorboards. I am meeting my fiancé," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "A fiancé? The other jeered. "One of them catalog husbands, I reckon. Hope he ain't too disappointed when he sees the goods ain't as advertised in the picture." Before Claire could wither completely under their crude assessment, Elias Wynne materialized beside her, his smile easy, his manner disarmingly pleasant. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth as riverstone, "forgive my intrusion, but I couldn't help but overhear. You seem to be men of discernment. Perhaps you'd care for a small wager on the lady's fortitude. I, for one, would wager this fine silver dollar that she possesses more grit than any two men in this establishment." He produced the coin with a flourish, then, with a series of impossibly deft movements, made it vanish, only to pluck it seemingly from the ear of the more aggressive trapper. The trappers, momentarily stunned by the gambler's audacity and the inexplicable appearance of the coin, stared blankly. Elias chuckled softly. "Or perhaps," he continued, his eyes twinkling, "you'd prefer to test your luck against a deck that has seen more bluffs than a Colorado canyon. Though I must warn you, she's a fickle mistress." He fanned his worn cards with practiced ease. The sudden shift in focus, the subtle challenge, and the hint of something unreadable in Wynne's cool gaze effectively deflated the trapper's bravado. They grumbled, cast a wary glance at the gambler, and shuffled away to find easier sport. Claire looked at Elias, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Wynne," she whispered. "Think nothing of it, Miss Marlowe," he replied, his smile softening. Sometimes a little misdirection is all that's needed to change the odds. He tipped his hat and moved towards the coffee pot, leaving Claire to wonder at the quiet chivalry of the elegant gambler. The respite was short-lived. Back in the coach, the storm seemed to redouble its fury. The driver, a man named Silas, his face a mask of grim concentration, fought to keep the team on the barely discernible track. Darkness was falling, and with it, A deeper, more primal chill. Then, with a sickening lurch and the sharp crack of splintering wood, disaster struck. A front wheel, succumbing to a hidden rut beneath the snow, shattered. One of the lead horses screamed, its legs scrabbling for purchase on the icy incline. Before going down in a tangle of harness, the coach slewed violently, teetering on the brink of a steep, snow-filled ravine. Inside, passengers were thrown against each other, cries of alarm mingling with the terrified neighing of the horses. When the violent motion finally ceased, they were tilted at a precarious angle, the wind howling through the broken window like a triumphant demon. "Everyone all right?" Boone bellowed, shaking off the daze of the impact. A chorus of shaken affirmatives answered him. He felt a sharp pain in his shoulder where he'd been thrown against the doorframe. But it seemed minor. The immediate concern was their exposure. After a perilous effort, they managed to unhitch the remaining horses and calm them. The coach, however, was hopelessly crippled. Silas, his face grim, confirmed their worst fears. Axles snapped clean through. "Marshal, we ain't going nowhere in this rig tonight, or for a good while after." The wind bit at them, laden with ice particles that stung like needles. Hypothermia was a real and present danger. "There's a hunter's lean-to, or maybe a shallow cave system, marked on an old survey map about half a mile back, towards that stand of pine," Boone recalled, peering through the blinding snow. "Our best chance is to make for it." The trek was an ordeal. Snowdrifts clutched at their legs, the wind tore at their clothes, and the biting cold sapped their strength. Boone, his injured shoulder throbbing, led the way, with Elias Wynne and John Granger helping to break trail. Sister Mercy, surprisingly spry for her age, supported Martha Granger, while Claire, her earlier anxieties momentarily forgotten in the face of immediate peril, carried a sleepy, whimpering Molly. Even Jesse Rook, still manacled, played his part when they finally stumbled upon a shallow, wind-scoured cave nestled amongst a tumble of boulders at the edge of the pine forest. It was Jesse who, with a surprising ingenuity, used his cuffed hands to help Boone clear away fallen branches and snow from the entrance. His movements economical and efficient despite the restraints. The cave was small, damp, and smelled of wet earth and old animal spoor, but it offered shelter from the storm's relentless assault. A fire was a desperate necessity. While Elias and John Granger searched for dry wood beneath the snow-laden trees, Boone, wincing, examined his shoulder. Sister Mercy was beside him in an instant. "Let me see that, Marshal," she said, her voice gentle but firm, the authority of the former nurse resurfacing effortlessly. With practiced hands, she examined the injury. A nasty bruise, perhaps a pulled ligament, but nothing broken. Thank Providence. She tore a strip from her own spare petticoat to fashion a makeshift sling. As the small, sputtering fire began to cast flickering shadows on the cave walls, a fragile sense of community began to form amongst the disparate travelers. Molly Granger, recovering her spirits with the resilience of childhood, wandered over to where Jesse Rook sat, slightly apart from the others, his gaze fixed on the flames. She held out a small, crudely carved wooden bird, one of her few toys. "Birdie," she announced, her small voice clear in the sudden lull of the wind. Jesse looked at her, his usually shuttered expression softening almost imperceptibly. He hesitated, then slowly reached out his cuffed hands and gently took the offered toy. Molly, undeterred by the manacles or the grim reputation that preceded him, climbed into his lap, leaning against him as if he were a familiar friend. "You're cold," she observed, patting his arm. Boone watched them, a strange ache in his chest. For the first time since his capture, someone was looking at Jesse Rook not as a prisoner, not as a threat, but simply as a person, and perhaps, Boone thought, in the innocent eyes of a child, there was a truth the law often overlooked. The storm raged on outside, but within the fragile sanctuary of the cave, a different kind of journey had begun, one of shared hardship and the unexpected forging of human connection. The fragile truce forged by shared peril held within the cramped, smoky confines of the cave, but the relentless siege of the blizzard outside was a constant, gnawing reminder of their precarious situation. Day bled into an indistinguishable twilight, the howling wind a ceaseless tormentor, the small fire, their only bulwark against the soul-deepening cold, consumed their dwindling supply of scavenged firewood with alarming speed. Rations, already meager, were stretched thin, each mouthful a conscious calculation against an unknown number of days they might remain trapped. Water, melted snow collected in a battered pot, was precious as gold. Hope, too, was a dwindling resource, flickering like the last embers of their fire. It was on what Boone guessed to be the second full day of their entombment that Jesse Rook began to succumb to a fever. His youthful resilience, already taxed by imprisonment and the journey, frayed. He shivered violently, despite the relative warmth near the fire, his skin clammy and flushed, his breathing shallow. Sister Mercy, her brow furrowed with concern, laid a gentle hand on his forehead. "He's burning up, Marshal," she announced, her voice low and grave. "We need to get these manacles off him. He needs to be able to move freely, to be properly tended." Boone, huddled nearby, his own injured shoulder a dull, persistent ache, shook his head, the movement stiff. "Can't do that, sister. He's a prisoner of the territory. My responsibility to deliver him, cuffs and all. And if he dies in these cuffs before you can deliver him," Mercy countered, her usually gentle eyes flashing with a spark of the old Flanagan fire. "What then, Boone? Will the territory thank you for delivering a corpse bound by its laws but failed by its humanity?" Boone's jaw tightened. The conflict was etched on his weathered face. He glanced at the boy, now curled in on himself, a low moan escaping his lips. Little Molly Granger, who had taken to sitting near Jesse, looked up with wide, frightened eyes. Claire Marlowe, from her shadowed corner, watched the exchange, her gaze lingering on Jesse's fevered form with an unreadable expression. She saw not just a prisoner, but a young man, vulnerable and suffering, and a disquieting empathy stirred within her. Boone himself was not faring well, though he did his best to conceal it. The throbbing in his shoulder had intensified, a band of fire tightening around his arm and chest. He moved with a careful rigidity, his face pale beneath its weathered tan. Sister Mercy, however, missed little later as she offered him a tin cup of weak, lukewarm tea. Her gaze sharpened. "You're favoring that shoulder more than you let on, Boone Calder," she stated, her tone leaving no room for denial. "And you've a feverish glint in your own eye. Don't think you can fool an old nurse who's seen more feigning and more genuine suffering than you've had hot dinners." Before he could protest, she was gently probing the swollen joint, her touch surprisingly strong. "This is getting worse. Infection, perhaps. You need to take something for the pain and the fever." She rummaged in the small satchel she always carried, producing a small vial of dark liquid, willow bark and laudanum. "It'll help. Now, no arguments," he grumbled but submitted, the familiar scent of the laudanum instantly transporting him back decades, to field hospitals rank with the smell of blood and fear. And Mercy Flanagan, younger, then, but with that same unwavering resolve in her eyes, tending to the endless stream of wounded. "You were always a stubborn woman, Mercy," he muttered, wincing as the potent medicine hit his tongue. "And you were always too proud to admit when you needed help." "Boone," she retorted, but her eyes softened with a shared memory, a flicker of the deep, unspoken bond forged in the crucible of war. "We saw too many good men lost to pride and neglected wounds back then. I won't let you be another." Elias Wynne, ever the pragmatist, seemed to sense the deepening gloom. He set about trying to lighten the atmosphere, his smooth voice weaving stories of riverboat gamblers and lucky streaks in dusty saloons. He even produced his worn deck of cards, performing simple tricks for Molly, coaxing a rare, bright laugh from the child that momentarily pierced the oppressive atmosphere. Claire watched him, a faint smile playing on her lips, grateful for the distraction. It was then, as he fanned the cards with a practiced flourish, that she noticed it. a faded but distinct regimental crest, an eagle clutching arrows, imprinted on the ace of spades. Her breath caught. She'd seen insignias like it on the uniforms of Union officers during the war, on flags draped over coffins. Elias Wynne, the suave, unflappable gambler. What was his connection to the military? A deserter, perhaps, as some whispers in Carson's Ridge had insinuated, or a cashiered officer, his past carefully buried beneath a veneer of polished charm. The discovery added another layer of mystery to the enigmatic man, another thread in the tangled tapestry of their forced companionship. The fragile equilibrium was shattered later that evening by a new crisis. Molly Granger, who had been coughing sporadically, suddenly began to struggle for breath, her small chest heaving, a terrifying wheezing sound escaping her lips. Her asthma, Martha Granger cried, her face a mask of terror as she clutched her daughter. The smoke, the cold. Oh, dear Lord, she can't breathe. Panic seized the small group. John Granger wrung his hands helplessly. Boone pushed himself upright, his own discomfort forgotten. Sister Mercy rushed to the child's side, her medical knowledge limited in the face of such an acute attack without proper remedies. It was Jesse Rook who reacted with unexpected swiftness. Despite his fever and the encumbrance of his manacles, he pushed himself to his knees. Her cloak. "Give me her cloak," he rasped, his voice hoarse, confused. Martha handed it to him. With fumbling, feverish movements, Jesse draped the thick woolen cloak over Molly's head and his own, creating a small, enclosed tent. "Steam," he muttered, gesturing towards the pot of melting snow water simmering near the fire. "Warm, moist air helps sometimes." Boone, understanding the desperate logic, carefully moved the pot closer, allowing the steam to rise into the makeshift shelter. For long, agonizing minutes, the only sounds were Molly's ragged gasps and Jesse's low, murmuring words, too faint to discern. Slowly, miraculously, the terrible wheezing began to subside. Molly's breathing eased, the panic receding from her small face. When Jesse finally drew back the cloak, his own face was slick with sweat, his breathing labored. But Molly was looking up at him, her eyes filled with a child's simple, unwavering trust. A collective sigh of relief went through the cave. John Granger clasped Jesse's arm, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, son," he choked out. You saved her." Even Boone felt a grudging respect for the young prisoner. The boy had acted, and acted decisively. When others had been paralyzed by fear, perhaps Mercy was right. Perhaps there was more to Jesse Rook than the crime that had landed him in irons. The incident, however, brought the harsh realities of their dwindling supplies into sharper focus. Later, as a semblance of quiet returned, Claire, seeking a dipper of water, noticed John Granger by their small stack of provisions. His movements were furtive, his back to the group. She saw him slip a handful of hardtack biscuits, part of their shared, carefully rationed food, into his coat pocket. Her eyes met his for a fleeting second, and she saw a flicker of shame, quickly masked by a defensive scowl. Before he turned away, no words were spoken, but the silent, uncomfortable truth hung in the air. The veneer of civilization was thin, easily scratched away by the primal urge for survival. As the long, cold night deepened, and the others finally succumbed to an exhausted, fitful sleep, Jesse Rook, his fever still a dull fire in his veins, sat propped against the cave wall near the entrance. Boone, despite his earlier refusal, had used his own key to unlock one of Jesse's manacles, allowing him a little more freedom of movement after his efforts with Molly. The single iron cuff still gleamed dully in the dying firelight. The wind had dropped slightly, but the cold was intense, seeping through the rock, chilling them to the marrow. Jesse pulled his thin prison-issue jacket tighter around himself, his gaze fixed on the cave mouth, a silent, self-appointed sentinel. Claire, unable to sleep, lay huddled in her blankets, her mind a whirl of anxieties and new, unsettling awarenesses. She watched Jesse from the shadows, his silhouette stark against the faint glow of the embers. He didn't move for what seemed like hours, a solitary, enigmatic figure keeping watch while the others slept, bearing the cold and his own discomfort without complaint. Why, she wondered, would a condemned man, a supposed outlaw, take it upon himself to guard the very people who held him captive, who represented the society that had judged him? The question, like the image of his still figure against the dying fire, lingered in her thoughts. Another mask, subtly, irrevocably, beginning to fall. The gray, uncertain light of another snow-choked dawn crept into the cave, revealing the haggard faces of its unwilling occupants. Jesse Rook, having relinquished his silent vigil to a restless Elias Wynne, was now asleep, his breathing still raspy, but the fierce heat of his fever somewhat abated, thanks to Sister Mercy's ministrations and the warmth of Molly's innocent proximity. The child having insisted on snuggling close to her cave friend under her parents' anxious gaze. The fire was little more than a handful of glowing coals, and the woodpile had dwindled to a few pathetic sticks. The wind, though slightly less violent than before, still moaned around the cave entrance, a constant reminder of their frozen prison. Elias, who had ventured out briefly at first light to survey their surroundings, returned with a grim set to his usually unruffled features. He brushed snow from his coat, his eyes scanning the faces of the waking group before settling on Boone. "Marshal," he said, his voice low and devoid of its usual lightheartedness, "we've got a problem. Or rather, another one." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "There are tracks out there. Not ours. Not animal. Leastways not four-legged. Moccasins, by the look of 'em. Fresh?" Since the wind died down some, at least 2 men, maybe more, circling wide around our position. A chill, deeper than the cave's ambient cold, settled over the group. John Granger's hand instinctively went to his wife, while Martha pulled Molly closer. Claire felt her heart constrict. Boone, propped against the cave wall, his face pale but his eyes still sharp, absorbed the news without visible reaction, though Sister Mercy noted the tightening of his jaw. What kind of sign did they leave? "Wynne, they're being cautious." "Marshal," Elias replied, his gambler's eyes narrowed in calculation, "keeping their distance. But they know we're here. I'd wager they saw the smoke from our fire yesterday, or what was left of the coach. My guess, trappers caught out like us, or," he added, his voice dropping further, "something less savory. Fur smugglers, perhaps, desperate men, in any case, and desperate men in a blizzard. They don't always abide by polite society's rules." The unspoken threat hung heavy in the frigid air. These weren't just phantoms of the storm. They were a tangible, human danger. Claire felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to unburden herself of the secret that had weighed on her since Carson's Ridge. The fear of unknown men lurking outside was somehow more terrifying than the prospect of her fellow passengers knowing her vulnerability. "Marshal Calder," she began, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to keep it steady. All eyes turned to her. There's something you should all know." She took a deep breath. "I am carrying my dowry with me. Coins, sewn into the lining of my dress." Her hand went instinctively to her skirt. "It's not a great sum, but perhaps enough to tempt someone who is desperate." A wave of fear washed over her. "Do you think? Could someone have known? Before the accident?" Elias Wynne's gaze sharpened, but he said nothing. Boone looked at her, his expression grim. "Hard to say. Miss Marlowe, news travels in strange ways, but it makes our situation more complicated." He pushed himself up straighter, wincing as pain shot through his injured shoulder. "We need to be prepared." That night, the wind picked up again, and with it came a new terror. A series of low, guttural growls echoed from the darkness beyond the cave entrance, followed by the chilling, unmistakable sound of a wolf pack's hunting howl. They were close, drawn by the faint scent of their dwindling food supplies, or perhaps by the lingering smell of the unfortunate horses. The embers of the fire cast long, dancing shadows, magnifying their fears. Molly whimpered, burying her face in her mother's skirts. John Granger fumbled for the old single-shot pistol Boone had allowed him to keep. Elias Wynne stood near the entrance, his dapper demeanor replaced by a tense alertness. A long, wicked-looking skinning knife, produced from somewhere within his coat, now in his hand. Suddenly, a pair of glowing eyes appeared at the very edge of the firelight. Then another, and another. The wolves, gaunt and bold with hunger, were venturing closer. Before anyone could react, Jesse Rook, who had been sitting quietly, his one free hand resting on his locket, surged to his feet. With a desperate, hoarse cry, he snatched a burning branch from the dying fire. Ignoring the searing pain as embers scorched his skin, he charged towards the cave entrance, waving the makeshift torch, yelling incoherently. "Jesse, no!" Boone shouted, struggling to rise, but a wave of dizziness and pain forced him back. The wolves, startled by the sudden onslaught of fire and noise from this unexpected quarter, hesitated, then scattered back into the darkness, their disappointed snarls fading into the wind. Jesse stood framed in the entrance for a moment, a wild, solitary figure, the flaming branch held aloft, before he stumbled back inside, dropping the brand and collapsing near the fire. Coughing, his face contorted in pain from his burned hand and the exertion. Sister Mercy was at his side instantly, her face a mixture of fear and fierce admiration. Claire stared at him, her heart pounding, a torrent of conflicting emotions, terror, gratitude, and a bewildering sense of awe washing over her. He had risked himself, unequivocally, for all of them. The immediate danger had passed, but the incident exposed their vulnerabilities anew. Boone, weakened by his injury and the lingering effects of his fever, was clearly in no condition to command. He knew it, and the painful realization was a fresh wound to his marshal's pride. The question of leadership, unspoken until now, hung heavy in the air. Elias Wynne, his composure regained, stepped into the void. "Marshal," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "you need to conserve your strength. Someone needs to make decisions for the group. Clear-headed decisions." Boone's gaze was bleak. "And you reckon that's you, Wynne? I reckon I'm less hampered by injury than you." "Marshal," Elias replied coolly, "and perhaps less emotionally invested in certain outcomes." His eyes flickered towards Jesse, who was now slumped against the wall, Mercy tending to his burned hand. John Granger, emboldened by Jesse's heroism with Molly, spoke up. "The boy there, Rook. He showed courage. He knows this land." Perhaps Jesse himself remained silent, his head bowed, offering no claim. The tension was palpable. Three men, the wounded lawman, the enigmatic gambler, the silent prisoner who had become an unlikely protector. It was Elias who brought the simmering conflict to a boil, his next words falling like stones into a frozen pond. "Those tracks I saw earlier," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though everyone in the small cave could hear him. "If those are smugglers, or worse, outlaws, they're desperate. We have little to offer them, except perhaps—" He paused, his gaze deliberately avoiding Jesse, yet clearly indicating him a way out for one of their own kind, or a scapegoat. "Rook is already a condemned man. If we were to offer him to them, let them take him in exchange for our safe passage, or simply for them to leave us be. It might be the only way to ensure the survival of the rest of us, especially the women and the child." A horrified silence descended. Martha Granger gasped, clutching Molly tighter. Claire felt a wave of revulsion. This was a cold, calculated pragmatism she hadn't expected, even from Wynne. "You can't be serious, Wynne," Boone rasped, his voice hoarse with disbelief and anger. "We don't trade human lives, not even a prisoner's." "Don't we, Marshal?" Elias countered, his voice dangerously soft. "What is one life, already forfeit by your law, against the lives of 5, possibly 6, innocent people? It's a grim equation, I grant you, but one that desperate men must sometimes consider. John Granger looked torn, his fear for his family warring with the gratitude he felt towards Jesse. But he saved Molly, and we are grateful for that. Mr. Granger, Elias said smoothly, but gratitude won't shield us from men with guns and empty bellies. Sentiment is a luxury we can no longer afford. The cave seemed to shrink, the air thick with unspoken accusations and terrifying choices. They were divided, fear gnawing at the fragile bonds of their shared misfortune. It was Sister Mercy who finally broke the deadlock, her voice, though quiet, cutting through the strained atmosphere with the clarity of a church bell on a winter morning. "Enough," she said, her gaze sweeping over their faces, resting for a moment on Elias, then on Boone, then on Jesse, who had raised his head, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity, but also a deep, weary resignation. This is not a decision to be made in anger or in fear. We are not savages, to offer one of our own to the wolves, literal or figurative. She rose slowly to her feet, her small figure radiating an unexpected authority. "There will be no trading of souls in this company, not while I draw breath. However," she continued, her voice softening slightly, "Mr. Wynne has raised a question of trust, and Mr. Rook's status is unique. Therefore, I propose this: we will decide, as a group, whether we continue to afford Mr. Rook our protection and consider him one of us in this predicament, or whether we isolate him further." Her gaze was compassionate, but firm. "And how do you propose we do that, Sister?" Boone asked, his voice heavy with fatigue. "We will vote," Sister Mercy declared. "Each adult here will cast a vote. I will tear strips from my spare apron. A plain strip means you believe Mr. Rook should remain with us, fully a part of this group. A strip with a knot tied in it," she paused, "means you believe he poses a continued risk, or that Mr. Wynne's grim alternative should be considered further." She looked directly at Elias. "And it will be a secret ballot. Each of us will answer to our own conscience, and to God. No one will know how another has chosen, only what the collective will of this company shall be." She began to tear the cloth, her movements deliberate. The only sounds in the cave were the rip of fabric and the heavy breathing of its occupants. The fate of Jesse Rook, and perhaps the very soul of their small, stranded community, hung suspended in the flickering firelight, waiting to be decided by a handful of torn strips and the silent, secret deliberations of the human heart. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The silence that followed Sister Mercy's pronouncement was profound, broken only by the hiss of the dying fire and the ragged breathing of the assembled company. Each adult, Boone, his face a mask of pain and duty. Claire, pale but resolute. Elias, his gambler's composure for once visibly strained. John and Martha Granger, their expressions etched with fear and a dawning parental responsibility that transcended their own survival, took one of the torn strips of apron. One by one, they approached a small crevice in the cave wall, a place Sister Mercy had designated, and deposited their vote, their conscience, their only witness. Jesse Rook watched them, his fever-bright eyes holding a strange mixture of detachment and an almost unbearable vulnerability. He did not vote, nor was he asked. He was the subject, not a participant, in this grim referendum on his worth. When all had cast their lot, Sister Mercy retrieved the small pile of fabric. Her hands did not tremble as she counted. 4 plain strips, 2 knotted. Her gaze, when she lifted it, was filled with a quiet, profound relief that seemed to illuminate the dim cave. "The company has decided," she announced, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Rook remains with us, as one of us." A collective sigh, almost imperceptible, whispered through the cave. Elias Wynne inclined his head, a flicker of something unreadable. Respect. Resignation. In his eyes, Boone Calder gave a slow, deliberate nod, the lines around his mouth softening almost imperceptibly. John Granger reached out and briefly clasped Jessie's arm, a silent apology and affirmation. Claire felt a lightness spread through her, an easing of a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. Jesse himself simply closed his eyes for a moment, his shoulders slumping as if a great weight had been lifted. The immediate crisis of their internal division had passed. The storm, however, still held them captive. Molly's breathing, though eased by Jesse's quick thinking with the steam tent, remained shallow, and a persistent, dry cough rattled her small frame. She needs something to soothe that cough. To open her chest, Sister Mercy worried. Her medical supplies long since exhausted. There's a wild cherry bark and coltsfoot. They often grow in sheltered spots, even in winter, near the base of pines. I've seen cherry trees back along the trail, before the worst of the drifts, Jesse offered, his voice still rough from his fever. And the smoke, and I know coltsfoot by its leaf. Even under snow, Claire, her earlier fear somewhat abated by the group's decision, and a growing, inexplicable trust in the young prisoner, found herself speaking up. I can help. I know some herbs from my mother. I can look too. She needed to do something, anything, to feel useful, to combat the suffocating sense of helplessness. Boone, after a moment's hesitation, nodded. The vote had changed things. He still wore the badge, but the lines of the law had blurred in the face of their shared extremity. All right, Rook, Miss Marlowe, but be careful. Don't go far. And Wynne. He looked towards the gambler. Perhaps you could keep an eye out from the cave mouth. Give a shout if you see anything amiss. He still didn't fully trust the elegant card sharp, but Elias's keen eyes were an asset. The single manacle still on Jesse's left wrist was a silent reminder of Boone's lingering official duty, but the key now lay in Boone's pocket, unused since the vote. So, Claire and Jesse, an unlikely pair bound by circumstance and a fragile, burgeoning understanding, ventured out from the relative shelter of the cave into the stark, white wilderness. The wind had lessened, but the air was biting cold, the snow deep and treacherous. They moved slowly, Jesse breaking trail, his gaze scanning the landscape with an intensity that spoke of familiarity with harsh environments. Claire followed, her eyes searching the base of snow-dusted pines for any sign of the plants Sister Mercy had described. They found a small stand of wild cherry saplings not far from the cave, their bark dark against the snow. As Jesse carefully scraped away a few strips with a sharp stone, Claire spotted a patch of broad, hoof-shaped leaves peeking through the snow nearby. Coltsfoot, she exclaimed, relief flooding her. It was as they knelt, gathering the precious herbs, their backs to a dense thicket of snow-laden firs, that the attack came. There was no warning, just the sudden, terrifying crack of a rifle shot splintering the silence, followed by a man's rough shout. Two figures erupted from the trees, clad in rough furs, their faces obscured by scraggly beards and the brims of their hats. The very men whose tracks Elias had discovered. Well, what have we here? One of them snarled, his rifle leveled. A pretty little doe and her protector. His gaze lingered on Jesse. You the fella from the wrecked coach. Before Jesse or Claire could react, another shot rang out, this time from a different direction. Back towards the cave, one of the ambushers cried out, clutching his arm, his rifle clattering onto the snow. The second man spun around, confused and angry. Elias Wynne stepped into view from behind a snowdrift, a smoking Colt Dragoon steady in his hand, his usual suave demeanor gone, replaced by a deadly focus. I believe, gentlemen, he said, his voice dangerously calm, you've mistaken your quarry. And you're welcome. The ambusher, whose arm was injured, seeing Elias, let out a string of curses. Wynne, you damn traitor. I knew we should have gutted you back in Santa Fe. So, These were Elias's ghosts. Claire realized with a jolt of fear. Not just fellow travelers of the storm, but men from his hidden past. The uninjured man, recovering quickly, raised his rifle towards Elias, but Jesse, reacting with astonishing speed, launched himself at the attacker, tackling him low, sending them both sprawling into a deep snowdrift. Claire screamed, scrambling backwards, her precious herbs spilling from her skirt. The fight was brutal and desperate. Elias exchanged fire with the wounded man, who, despite his injury, fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Shots echoed through the frozen forest. Claire saw Elias stagger, a dark stain blossoming on his fine coat. But he kept firing, his shots methodical, deadly. Jesse, meanwhile, wrestled with the larger man in the snow, the single manacle on his wrist. A hindrance, but not a deterrent. He fought with a silent, desperate intensity, using his agility and the element of surprise. Finally, with a guttural cry, he managed to wrest the rifle away, bringing the butt down hard on his opponent's head. The man went limp. By the time Boone, alerted by the gunfire and moving with a pained urgency, arrived on the scene with John Granger, the short, vicious battle was over. Both ambushers lay still in the snow, but the victory was costly. Elias Wynne leaned heavily against a tree, his face ashen, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The front of his coat was soaked with blood. Claire rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she tried to staunch the flow. "Elias," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He looked up at her, a faint, wry smile touching his lips. "Always knew. The cards would turn against me. Someday." Miss Marlowe. His gaze flickered towards Jesse, who stood panting, bruised but alive. "You fought well, Rook. Better than I did. Back then." His eyes clouded with a pain that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. "Don't talk, Elias," Sister Mercy said, appearing as if from nowhere, her face grim as she assessed his injuries. "Save your strength." But Elias shook his head slightly. "No strength left. Sister." He coughed, a fleck of blood on his lips. "Should have stayed on the riverboats. Cleaner game." His eyes found Boone's. Tell them in Carson City. I paid my dues." Finally, his voice faded to a whisper. His eyes fluttered closed, and with a soft sigh, the elegant gambler, the man of hidden pasts and unexpected loyalties, was still. The silence that followed was broken only by Claire's choked sobs and the mournful sigh of the wind through the pines. The raw brutality of the encounter, the suddenness of Elias Wynne's death, left them all shaken to the core. They had lost one of their own, a man who, in his final moments, had chosen to protect them, to atone for a past they could only guess at. Later, as they huddled back in the relative safety of the cave, the bodies of the ambushers left to the indifferent snow. The mood was somber, reflective. It was then, in the quiet aftermath of violence and loss, that Jesse Rook finally spoke of his own story. He sat by the fire, the tarnished silver locket resting in his palm, his voice low and uneven as he recounted the events that had led him to this desolate place. "The man I killed, back in the Sweetwater Valley. It was self-defense," he began, his gaze fixed on the flames. "He was a bully, a drunkard, always causing trouble. He came after my younger brother, Tommy." "Tommy? He's not strong." "He was just a boy. This man, he was going to hurt him badly." Jesse's voice choked. "I tried to stop him. We fought. His own knife. It happened so fast." He looked up, his eyes filled with a deep, aching sorrow. Tommy was terrified. He wouldn't have stood a chance if they'd blamed him. "So I told the sheriff I did it, that it was me alone. I sent Tommy away, told him to run, to make a new life. This locket," he touched it gently. "It was our ma's. I gave it to him. But he must have dropped it when he fled. They found it on me." Boone Calder listened, his expression unreadable. He had seen the raw courage in Jesse during the ambush, the selfless protection of Claire. He had witnessed Elias Wynne, a man he suspected of being a deserter, die a hero's death. And now, this confession, the world, which had always seemed so black and white, so governed by the clear lines of the law, was becoming a place of bewildering, heartbreaking grays. He rose stiffly, walked over to Jesse, and with a quiet deliberation that resonated through the silent cave, he produced the key from his pocket and unlocked the remaining manacle from Jesse's wrist. The metallic click was deafeningly loud. Then, he unbuckled his own gun belt, the one holding his service revolver, and offered it, but first, to the young man. "The law is a clumsy tool sometimes, son," Boone said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I reckon I've been clumsy with it more than once. A man's defined by his actions, by the choices he makes when things get hard, not just by the words on a warrant." He met Jesse's astonished gaze. "You've shown your measure, more than once," as if to underscore Boone's words. Sister Mercy spoke, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight. "Marshal," she said, "I believe I've met Mr. Rook before, or someone very like him." All eyes turned to her. "During the war," she continued, her gaze distant, "I was nursing near Vicksburg. There was a young volunteer, a boy, really, not much older than Mr. Rook is now. He wasn't a soldier, more of a camp helper. One day, during a skirmish, a colored man, a freedman working with the Union Ambulance Corps, was hit, left for dead by his own side. I'm ashamed to say, but this boy, this young volunteer, he went out under fire, dragged that wounded man back to our lines, and stayed with him until he was tended. He had the same quiet courage, the same disregard for his own safety when another was in need." Her eyes rested on Jesse, a gentle understanding in their depths. "I never knew his name, but I never forgot his face." Jesse looked at her, a flicker of recognition, of a shared, unspoken memory, passing between them. He said nothing, but the slight inclination of his head was acknowledgement enough. In the days that followed, as the storm finally began to abate, and the world outside their cave slowly reappeared from beneath its blanket of white, a new dynamic settled over the surviving members of the ill-fated stagecoach journey. Elias Wynne was buried in a shallow grave beneath the pines, his sacrifice a somber bond between them. Jesse, no longer a prisoner but a trusted member of their small band, worked tirelessly alongside Boone and John Granger, helping to prepare for their eventual trek out of the mountains. Claire Marlowe found herself watching Jesse with a new awareness. The fear and suspicion she had once felt were gone, replaced by a profound respect and a burgeoning tenderness that both surprised and unsettled her. She saw the quiet strength in him, the innate decency that had been hidden beneath layers of hardship and injustice. They spoke little, their interactions often limited to shared tasks or brief exchanges over the meager campfire. Yet, in those shared glances, in the small, unspoken kindnesses, a offered cup of water, a shared blanket against the lingering chill, a silent language of trust and mutual care began to develop. It was not the whirlwind romance of stories, but something quieter, deeper, an affection born in the crucible of shared loss and unexpected redemption, as fragile and as precious as the first wildflowers of spring pushing through the melting snow. The fragile dawn that finally heralded the storm's retreat painted the snow-covered peaks in hues of soft rose and pale lavender. It was a landscape reborn, beautiful yet still formidable. Elias Wynne lay in his shallow grave beneath the silent pines, a stark reminder of the price of their survival. But with the clearing skies came a fragile, resurgent hope. Jesse Rook, no longer a cuffed prisoner, but a young man who had earned their profound respect and trust, became their guide. His quiet knowledge of the mountains, gleaned from a youth spent in similar wild country before tragedy altered his path, now proved invaluable. The trek out was arduous. They were weakened by cold and hunger, their spirits battered by the ordeal. Boone, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch John Granger had fashioned, gritted his teeth against the pain in his shoulder. His authority now shared, almost deferred, to Jesse's quiet competence. Claire walked beside Jesse, her initial trepidation replaced by a steady resolve and a deepening awareness of the man who had so selflessly protected her. Sister Mercy, her habit showing the strains of their confinement, offered words of encouragement and tended to their various aches and scrapes, her presence a constant, gentle reassurance. The Grangers, with Molly bundled warmly between them, followed with a new, if weary, determination. After what felt like an eternity of struggling through deep drifts and navigating treacherous, ice-slicked slopes, Jesse led them to a small, dilapidated structure tucked into a sheltered valley, an abandoned Forest Service ranger station. It was deserted, a few tattered maps still clinging to the walls, a rusted stovepipe askew, but its four walls and a semblance of a roof felt like a palace. More importantly, a weathered signal flag and a small cache of old, damp flares were discovered in a locked footlocker. Jesse managed to pry open. With trembling hands, he and Boone managed to get one of the flares to ignite, sending a plume of crimson smoke into the clear, cold air, a desperate, hopeful beacon against the vast indifference of the wilderness. Rescue, when it finally came, 2 days later, in the form of a grizzled pair of volunteer rangers from a distant settlement, was almost anticlimactic. The story of their ordeal, however, once recounted in the small, bustling mining town of Redemption Creek, caused a considerable stir. The death of Elias Wynn and the 2 slain ambushers, later identified as known highwaymen with a string of robberies to their names, men who had indeed been Elias's former, treacherous associates, became the stuff of local legend almost overnight. Jesse Rook's situation, though, required a more formal resolution. Marshal Boone Calder, his arm now properly set and bound by the town's doctor, gave his official statement. He spoke of Jesse's courage, his selflessness in protecting Molly and Claire, his crucial role in their survival, and his actions during the ambush. Sister Mercy, her quiet dignity lending immense weight to her words, corroborated Boone's account. She also produced a small, leather-bound journal she had kept sporadically throughout their ordeal. In it, she had documented not only the events, but also her dawning recognition of Jesse from her Civil War nursing days, recounting the incident where he had saved the wounded colored ambulance driver. The courage of conviction, the instinct to protect the vulnerable. She testified to the circuit judge. These are not the marks of a hardened criminal, but of a man of innate, though perhaps unpolished, character. The final piece of evidence came unexpectedly. Amongst Elias Wynn's few recovered possessions, his worn deck of cards, a few dollars, and a tarnished silver pocket watch, was a small, oilskin-wrapped packet. Inside were several letters, old and creased, detailing Elias's own troubled past, his involvement with the gang he had ultimately turned against us, and, crucially, a mention of a young man in the Sweetwater Valley who had taken the fall for a Green Boy brother in a self-defense killing. A young man Elias had briefly encountered and pitied. The description matched Jesse perfectly. It seemed Elias, in his own way, had carried a piece of Jesse's truth with him. The exoneration, when it came, was swift and unconditional. The charges against Jesse Rook were dismissed. His name cleared. The relief that washed over him was palpable, a visible unburdening. He stood taller, the haunted look in his eyes receding, replaced by a quiet, steady light. A few days later, as they prepared to go their separate ways, Boone Calder approached Jesse. The old Marshal looked weary, the lines on his face etched deeper by their shared trial. He held out his hand, not for a handshake, but offering the simple, 5-pointed tin star that had been the symbol of his life's work. "I'm done, son," Boone said, his voice gravelly. "This last trip, it showed me some things. Mostly, that I'm getting too old for this life. And maybe," he added, a hint of a rueful smile touching his lips, "the law ain't always as clear-cut as it looks from behind this badge." Jesse stared at the star, then at Boone, his expression one of profound surprise. Marshal, I can't. It ain't an appointment. Jesse, Boone said, pressing the star into the young man's hand. It's a token of respect. You showed more true grit, more honor, in that cave, and out there in the snow, than many a man I've known who wore one of these by right. What you do with your life now is your own choice, but carry this as a reminder that a man's worth ain't decided by his past mistakes, but by the choices he makes when the chips are down. He clapped Jesse briefly on the shoulder, a rare gesture of affection, then turned and walked away, leaving Jesse holding the unexpected emblem of a life he had never sought, but a character he had undeniably proven. Claire Marlowe had decisions of her own to make. The thought of returning east, of facing her relatives with the story of her failed mail-order marriage for Mr. Silas Blackwood of Weaver's Creek had faded into an irrelevant shadow in her mind, filled her with a quiet dread. More than that, the thought of leaving this raw, challenging land, and the people she had come to know, especially Jesse, felt like an amputation. She found Jesse by the creek on the outskirts of town, skipping stones across the clear, cold water, the newly won tin star tucked carefully into his shirt pocket. Jesse, she began, her voice a little breathless. I've been thinking. He turned, his gaze meeting hers, open and questioning. I'm not going back east, she declared, a newfound firmness in her voice. And I'm not going on to Weaver's Creek. There's nothing for me there anymore. She paused, gathering her courage. Sister Mercy was speaking of the children in this settlement, how they have no proper schooling. And I know a little. My mother taught me. I thought perhaps I could start a small class. Here, Jesse listened, his expression softening. That's a fine idea, Claire. This place could use someone like you. And Sister Mercy said she would help. Claire continued, a hopeful blush rising on her cheeks. And maybe you would, too, if you're staying on. That is, you're good with your hands. You could help build things. A proper schoolhouse eventually. Her voice trailed off, her unspoken question hanging in the air. A slow smile spread across Jesse's face, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his features, chasing away the last of the shadows. Reckon I could get used to building things instead of breaking them, he said softly. And I reckon I'd like that very much. Claire, staying on, with you. The words were simple, unadorned, but they held a world of promise, a quiet affirmation of a future they would choose to build together. Molly Granger, thanks to the herbs and Sister Mercy's continued care, made a full recovery, her laughter once again echoing bright and clear. The Grangers, with the help of a small fund raised by the grateful townsfolk of Redemption Creek and a land grant secured through Boone's lingering influence, found a fertile patch of ground to call their own, their dream of a new life finally within reach. The story of the Carson's Ridge stagecoach, the one that had set out under a pall of ill omen and bitter cold, became a tale told around campfires and potbelly stoves for years to come. But as winter finally relinquished its icy grip and spring breathed new life into the Sierras, another image began to take shape in the collective memory of those who had survived. It was the image of a different kind of journey, not one etched on a map, but one embarked upon in the human heart. It was the image of a new stagecoach, perhaps rolling out not into a storm of forced obligation or desperate escape, but into the clear, hopeful light of a chosen dawn. On this stage, the passengers were not strangers bound by grim necessity, but companions, their faces turned towards a shared horizon. There was a young woman, her eyes bright with purpose, a quiet man with a lawman's star tucked near his heart as a reminder of honor, not authority, and an elderly nun whose faith had been tested and affirmed. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. A small band who had walked through the valley of frozen despair and emerged into the tentative, warming sunlight of hope. Their futures intertwined, their paths chosen. Together, the journey from the ice was over. The journey towards a new life, a life of their own making, had just begun. Some stories end with gunfire. This one ended with a choice and a quiet kind of courage. If this tale stirred something in you, maybe a memory, a question, or just a knot in your throat, you're not alone. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in their shoes? Did someone surprise you? Did someone change? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're the kind who sticks around for stories that don't always end clean, but always cut deep, go ahead and hit that subscribe button.